Welcome to the Streets and People podcast, where we explore having more transport options that are less hassle to use. Hosted by Get Around Caboolture, we bring you 3 types of episodes. People and Projects share stories of change. Not Everyone Drives gives voice to non-drivers. Road Rules 360 unpacks road rules for people outside a car. Music by Grand Project. And let's make our Grand Project reimagining streets made for people. Today we're doing one of our People and Projects episodes. I'm here in the studio with Emeritus Professor Peter Spearritt of the University of Queensland, who kindly is pulled out of retirement to be on our podcast today at the special request of one of our most ardent followers and supporters of the podcast. He sent me a paper called The 200 Kilometre City, and he asked that you come on the show. I'm here on Gubbi Gubbi country in Caboolture in Queensland, and perhaps you could say where you're calling from and also what made you interested in this whole area, perhaps a little bit about your background and what was the driver for writing that paper.
Well, I'm calling from Arakwal country, a bit north of Byron Bay. I guess my interest in Southeast Queensland stems from childhood trips. I grew up in Melbourne. Once a year we made a grand road trip to Queensland, first to visit my father's parents in Woolloongabba and then to visit my mother's parents who were in Gympie and then eventually in Buderim. So I've always had an interest in, I suppose, the whole development of Southeast Queensland. As a teenager, when we'd moved to Sydney, I used to get the train to South Brisbane station from Sydney. Then I'd hop on a Greyhound bus and my grandparents would come down from Buderim to meet me at what was called the Caloundra turn-off. I've just had a long interest since childhood in the whole road pattern, public transport, whether it works or not. And I suppose more professionally over the last 20 or 30 years, I've become very concerned about how much urban development in all the Australian capital cities, not just Brisbane, but also Sydney and Melbourne, how much of it has been freeway-led and how any other changes to the public transport system, whether rail, bus or trams, have always been in catch-up mode. They've never been proactive. So the freeways are being proactive. They cost an enormous amount of money, of course, freeway building, and public transport has always lagged behind.
Yeah, thanks for that. I guess I do want to go on to the 200 kilometre city, but what's your sense of why there is this lag between the freeways being done and, well, the expensive ways I like to call them, and public transport and other transport modes?
Well, historically, I think the roads lobby in Australian states was incredibly strong, and the roads lobby, this is in the 1950s and 1960s, is an intriguing amalgam of people selling motor cars, so all the major motor car manufacturing companies, and the motoring organisations, which until recently, and there are now some notable exceptions, these motoring organisations were absolutely one-eyed about the car. Everything had to be done about the car. Now, this is particularly worrying in a situation where at any one point in time, at least a third of the population can't drive. They can't drive because they're under 17. They can't drive because they haven't had a licence. They can't drive because they're much older and they're not passing their eye test anymore. So one big issue for our entire society is if a third of the population can't drive, what are we doing for them? And of course, many people can't afford to maintain a motor vehicle. So you've got all those sorts of issues. So the freeway lobby is remarkably successful until really the 1980s. The road lobby more broadly was so strong that some of the bridges built in Brisbane in the 1970s and 80s, like the Captain Cook Bridge from Kangaroo Point to the city centre, made no provision for pedestrians. Unbelievable. Pedestrians didn't count. Now, of course, the Brisbane River is almost littered with new pedestrian bridges, including one to a casino, for goodness sake. But we've gone from sort of no pedestrian-only bridges to almost half a dozen of them. it's an enormous catch-up, which is gradually happening now in all of the capital cities. Intriguingly, probably the best provision, among the best provided city in Australia for public transport is Brisbane, and the reason is that Brisbane is the only capital city with a metropolitan council. They amalgamated 13 little local government areas in 1924, and so in the 1990s, the Brisbane City Council, which of course has a huge budget, can get together with the state government, no matter who was in power, and agree to build that really quite impressive busway system in Brisbane, which on the whole complements the railway system. The problem for the smaller municipalities, even those that have now been amalgamated, including clearly the whole sort of Caboolture area, is that they don't have the sort of political or financial muscle to say to the state government, well, what are you going to do about public transport north of the Brisbane City Council area?
That's very true, and I did have a meeting recently with senior people at Moreton Bay Council, and it's a 10-year lead time to get good bus services, and then, as you say, 1 in 3 people can't drive. In the meantime, you've got people driving, and there is quite a lot of backlash about bicycle lanes on streets. There's a very vocal minority that like to be very vocal about why have bikes got any lanes and road space. I mean, maybe it's not a minority. What's your sense of that?
It's always going to be a difficulty in a car-oriented society. The bike lanes, of course, work best when they're not shared with the road system, but then that is really entirely dependent on the local topography. So you can have a fantastic bike lane along the Brisbane River, which admittedly is occasionally flood prone, but you've got the river there to have the bike lane away from the road system. The difficulty in many regional towns, probably most regional towns in Queensland, is that they don't have that kind of public space abutting a river that would nicely fit a bike lane. So that's always going to be a difficult area, I think. We're seeing occasionally some inspired bike lanes in country towns where you've got wider road verges and so on. People are always going to be at loggerheads, regrettably, about that, I suspect.
Yeah. So just going on to the article, the 200-kilometre city, Brisbane, the Gold Coast and the Sunshine Coast, which was published in 2009, and you're the sole author on that. It was in the Australian Economic History Review, and for our listener, I'll put that in the show notes so you can get that. And many thanks to our very ardent listener who sent this in, because it was very interesting, and I had never really thought about the issue of how sprawling Brisbane is as a whole city. So perhaps you could step through the article a little bit and give some broader context or any updates, further thoughts that you have.
Well, going back to childhood trips throughout Southeast Queensland, it used to be obvious when you'd left Brisbane and come to another area. So coming back to live in Brisbane in the early 2000s, I was rather appalled when you're driving up or down the freeway, either on the Pacific Motorway South or the Bruce Highway North. Going south, the only way you knew that you'd left Brisbane and come to Logan would be that there'd be a big sign on a freeway overbridge saying you are now entering Logan. But there'd be no green space between Brisbane and Logan. There's no green space between Logan and the Gold Coast. So you got this level of continuous suburbia, which to some extent the Sunshine Coast escaped perhaps the worst of it, but it's now catching up with all the development around Caloundra. I don't much like the idea that cities and towns lose their character through that kind of suburban sprawl. Really, when I started looking closely at it, you had to say that you had this linear development from Coolangatta to Noosa. You've got the pine plantations still on the Bruce Highway, but more and more of that is going to end up as suburbia. In a way, it's a miracle that the railway line to Gympie survived and will probably thrive in future. So you do have the rail spine, but the way the place is developed at the moment, it's not used nearly as heavily as it should, say through the Glasshouse Mountain stations and so on.
I think there are sections of the railway going north which the previous state government wanted to fill in, whereas the current state government have put a halt on that. I mean, that's my understanding. Is that your understanding?
Yep. Yeah, I think that's probably what's happened. And of course, for good and ill, people still want to live near the coast. So that railway line gets further and further from the coast as it travels north. So it's not servicing the really popular coastal areas. There's one other aspect of the transport system of Southeast Queensland, which compared to the rest of Australia is really unusual. You have three major airports only about 150 kilometres apart. They're almost entirely car-based, except, of course, we had the miracle of the train service to the Brisbane airport, which is really pleasing. And I should remind your listeners that Melbourne's Tullamarine still doesn't have a railway line to the city, because the Kennett government did a deal with Transurban when it was building its tollways, and the car was king. It was a big issue. It's disgraceful that Melbourne doesn't have a rail link to its airport. Sydney does, Brisbane does. Obviously, the Sunshine Coast Airport doesn't. To give you an insight into what the implications of a car-based airport are, when the Brisbane City Council was lobbying the University of Queensland to build the Green Bridge from St Lucia to Dutton Park, one of their arguments, which was a fantastic statistic at the time, is that the University of Queensland campus, this is in the early 2000s, generated more traffic movements even than Brisbane Airport, because you couldn't efficiently get to it from the south side of the city by public transport. You now can, which is a miracle. So it's a car-based mentality continues to pervade most of southeast Queensland, and of course public transport usage on both the Sunshine Coast and the Gold Coast is much, much lower than in the Brisbane City Council area.
Is there anything else you would like to talk about with regards to the 200 kilometre city article or other developments since that time?
Well, the difficulty with the 200 kilometre city in southeast Queensland is absolutely inadequate green space. So when we first started doing this research in the early 2000s, we measured the amount of what we call guaranteed green space in Sydney compared to Brisbane. And we took exactly the same size of geographical area. In Sydney, it was about 47% green space. In southeast Queensland, about 17%. Now, the reason is primarily that Sydney has these absolutely huge national parks, the Royal National Park in the south, the Blue Mountains National Park to the west, Ku-ring-gai Chase, and other national parks to the north, which effectively constrains urban development. The whole of southeast Queensland has no such constraints. The biggest national park on the Gold Coast strip is the Burleigh Heads National Park, which from memory is about 15 hectares. Tiny.
It's true, and even places like Bribie are becoming more and more suburbanised, and different islands as well.
Thank goodness for the Cooloola National Park north of Noosa, but you never had the major swathes of green space put aside here. There's nobody's fault in particular. I mean, it's partly because of incredibly topsy-turvy development, and it's too late, really, before people wake up to the fact that there should have been more national parks in a 200-kilometre long linear city.
And do you think that the sort of very gung-ho era of Joh Bjelke-Petersen had anything to do with that?
Oh, absolutely. We can thank Bjelke-Petersen for the fact that the Gold Coast now has 400 kilometres of canals. And the canal owners and the Kawana Waters will be quaking when the storm surges really build up in the next few years. So it was this kind of development at all and any cost sort of regime, which was, of course, very pro-developer. The Nicholson Way from Caloundra to Mooloolaba, I mean, all of those sorts of developments were all about opening up land for urban development. That was the primary focus, regrettably. And now all the councils have got to pay the catch up. You know, what green space can they save? Yeah, so it's certainly an ongoing thorn in the side of the region.
Well, that's true. So Caboolture is a major growth area. Moreton Bay is a major growth area. I think it's one of the fastest growing areas in the whole of Australia. And we moved up here a couple of years ago, not for retirement, but because my husband got a job here and he couldn't get a permanent job anywhere else because the employment conditions in Sydney where we lived were impossible. We moved up here because that's the only place that would give him a job. So this is an interesting thing on how employment plays a role.
Oh, absolutely. Yep.
And also housing costs and things like that. So how do you manage growth and green space and development and transport in a very fast growing area.
I mean, the difficulty is you've got to work out who are the players who've got the land. So state and local government are always going to be vital in this because they still own a lot of really crucial land parcels. What do they do with their land parcels? When people plan to expand a freeway, do they ever give any thought at all to whether the population might warrant either a dedicated bus lane or a tram line? I mean, we've got the example now of the Gold Coast reinserting, as it were, a tramway system into a conventional 1960s road network with, as far as I can see, a considerable amount of success. The political culture in Queensland on all sides of politics has always favoured the rights of the private property owner, which I think is very unfortunate. So for some reason, if a cane farmer decides that he wants to subdivide his cane farm into building blocks, he should be allowed to, and in the process become a multimillionaire. Yet the kind of community costs of that sort of development, they're never ending. And then when you get to the retrofitting, we're building a tunnel now under the Brisbane River, which the railway system desperately needs. But they already had the Clem 7 tunnel built under the Story Bridge. And at that point, that was when they should have thought about having a rail line in that as well. So you have a lot of mismatch, especially when governments turn to private enterprise to fund toll roads, because then private enterprise is virtually calling all the shots.
Yeah, so you are of a certain age and you remember a long time ago during the whole rise of the car, pretty much, I would assume, the heyday and also the beginning of recognizing to see these problems. So what has that journey been like as you look through the course of your life and the history of roads and transport? What do you see has been a regrettable loss? Because today everything is private ownership, whereas post-war it was much more in the public domain. So that shift, how do you feel that has affected transport outcomes and transport modes?
That's a big question. I mean, it's certainly true that government has retreated from a lot of activities that in my childhood we took for granted. Every Australian state built an enormous amount of public housing in the 1950s and 1960s, partly with state government, partly with federal government money. A lot of that has gone by the wayside. So the private sector is now having much more of a control over both the property market and the rental market. Transport, of course, has always been in a different category because it requires a lot of planning. You've got to have land to put aside or compulsorily acquire land, as governments have done for eons if they want to put through a new railway line. And it costs a lot of money. So governments tend to shy away from it until, as has happened in Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane, the public transport system is simply not coping. So suddenly in all three cities you get this huge cash injection for building new inner city train stations and outer suburban lines. The issue in Southeast Queensland is that probably now the worst served area for public transport is the Sunshine Coast. I mean, one of the ironies, I guess, of having the tramway system inserted in the Gold Coast is you can actually get a train to Helensburgh and then hop on a tram that'll take you to, say, Service Paradise. That's the first time that you've been able to get public transport to a Gold Coast surf beach since, disgracefully, the Southport to Tweed Heads railway line was ripped up in the early 1960s. When that railway line was ripped up, the then government treasurer, this is in about 1963, said that if Gold Coast workers needed to work in Brisbane for a day or two a week, they could get a helicopter. So it was a kind of a Jetsons idea of what a modern city would be like. You know, we'd all be just flying around in helicopters.
That's very funny because Moreton Bay wants to get into drones. So I think it's exactly the same. So this is the same kind of idea that we're relying on technology to come up with an answer when we actually already have very good solutions, it seems.
Yep, no, well, I love the idea that local governments will have their own drones, but presumably you'll have to have very strong arms to be carried by a drone up or down a hill.
And then you've got the whole issue of where do you land and where do you store them, which is exactly the same problem that you've got with cars. I have heard that for each car that somebody owns, there are 5 car spaces that are required. And of course, each car space has turning circle and apron and ingress and egress and all those sorts of things. It's a huge amount of land that gets taken up.
Yep, and the best stat I've ever heard on this is that the average car is not being used for about 97% of its time, but it takes up a lot of space when it's not being used.
So for people who are really strong adherents of the car, what are some ideas that you have that say, why should I give up my car? I want more lanes, I want to get there faster, I want congestion reduced, I'm not interested in public transport, I don't want to ride a bike, I think that's only for weak people and kids and, I don't want to do any of that. I think bicycle lanes just take up space on the road that cars should have, because the street is all about cars and movement of cars.
Yeah, well, it's certainly true that culturally die-hard car users are very hard to convert. There's a chap who taught town planning at the University of New South Wales who quipped in the 1970s, remember this is the 1970s, that if the average Australian male was allowed to, he'd park his car in the lounge room because it was his prized possession. It still amazes me how in a great deal of modern suburban housing on typical, though now smaller suburban blocks, the garage is often the principal architectural feature from the front of the house. And especially when it's a 2-car garage, it often takes up well over half of the frontage of the house. So I think it's very hard to get through to die-hard users, except to continue to point out to them that a third of the population can't drive. They themselves, by the time they're 75 or 80, are going to have a road test that they may not pass. Their eyesight will be failing. I mean, the one area I think where we have improved dramatically is in disabled access to public transport. I think that's been a really good improvement. That's the level of consciousness that's entered into the community. I mean, we know from a variety of research studies that most people, when they compare getting to work by public transport versus the car, never adequately cost or price in how long it took them to find a parking space. They just think about the length of the road journey versus the length of the public transport journey. But at least with public transport, you're not then fighting to find a car space at the end of it.
So we're heading up to the point where I ask, if somebody's in the community, actually one of our listeners is a gentleman who has a disability and struggles to get around and wants more public transport and wants better bus services. What do you suggest he can do to get the attention of TransLink and council and state? Obviously, bus services are a state issue in Moreton Bay. What do you suggest is something that he could do to encourage that to happen?
Well, I think the main hope in communities like Caboolture is that it might be financially viable to have smaller electric buses of the kinds that are quite common now in a lot of Asian cities. So instead of having buses that are going to seat between 50 to 80 people, you might have buses that seat perhaps 16 to 20, and then you've got to look at what kind of stops you can have and who the smaller buses are servicing. So when you're looking at the location of aged care facilities, hospitals, public libraries, if you were to pinpoint in any community some of the major locations that people want to get to, it may be possible to create different sorts of bus routes that on the whole we haven't had in the past. I mean, school bus routes tend, of course, to need bigger buses because you've got a greater congregation of school kids, I guess. So those sorts of bus systems don't necessarily certainly don't necessarily suit older adults who, for instance, don't necessarily want to jostle with 80 kids fighting each other on a school bus in the morning. But also, of course, people with a disability or older people probably won't mind a restricted number of hours of the bus service. It's not always necessary for them to travel at peak hour because they're not going to work or going to school.
So with a smaller bus, I had always thought that the big cost with a bus service was the driver, the operator. So what would be the advantage of getting a smaller bus instead of a larger bus, given you've got more flexibility then with where you can use a larger bus whereas you're a bit more restricted with a smaller bus.
The crass answer to that, of course, will be at what point do we get driverless buses, which is probably no more than about 10 years away. In the meantime, that's always going to be the difficulty. You've got relatively high labour costs. But of course, when you look at big metropolitan bus systems, they're running buses late at night with hardly anybody on them, but they still have to do it. I mean, a community bus, as I'm suggesting, might have much more restricted hours. It might be doing most of its travelling between perhaps 10 and 3.
I was thinking also that a smaller bus actually has a smaller surface parking area, storage area as well.
Well, yeah, you don't necessarily need the big parking spaces, which is a huge issue for the larger buses. But it's an interesting issue. Then it's a cost-sharing issue, isn't it? What level of funding would come from a local council versus the state government, for instance?
And say our listener is somebody at the local council and they're quite junior in the pecking order and they want to have more bike lanes. The organisation is not very interested in bike lanes. What's something they can do? I like to ask difficult questions here, Peter.
That's all right. That's okay. Yeah, well, that's a hard one. It just all depends on the local political culture. So, intriguingly, in the Melbourne Central Business District now, you actually have some bike-only lanes that are very well marked, and they're pretty heavily used in the Central Business District area. Now, I guess the one difficulty for the bike lobby is that they can't really cater for the total population. That's a political kind of issue for the bike lobby in a sense, and especially for older people or people with various disabilities. I think in terms of the bike lobby, it's partly being imaginative about what sorts of routes lend themselves to share bike lanes with pedestrians or not. I mean, they can take some heart from the fact that some of the rail trails now that have been putting in northern New South Wales and Southeast Queensland have been phenomenally successful, and sharing those sorts of trails, as long as they're wide enough for both pedestrians and bikes, has been successful. It's always going to be hard to intervene in the pre-existing road system. That's the challenge. I mean, one pleasing development, back to my point about how you can have a bike lane along parts of the Brisbane River, one pleasing development has been now that councils put much more emphasis on wetland provision than they've ever done before. There are actually now often ways of getting round a city centre area by using the wetlands, often just on the outskirts, and not just assuming you have to be able to cycle straight through the middle of town. There are some imaginative examples of that in recent times.
So encouraging spaces that are actually in parklands or in green areas.
Making better use of them, yep.
And those ever diminishing green areas.
Indeed. Yeah, that's right, yep.
Which are slowly evaporating.
But, you can have a bike lane between a couple of ovals that'll work. And we shouldn't regard golf courses as sacrosanct from use as bike lanes. Golf courses ought to be a public facility, not just for golfers.
All right, so we're coming up towards the end of time. Any final thoughts, any closing remarks, anything else that you wish that I had asked that I didn't get around to asking?
Well, I think the intriguing issue for the whole Caboolture Glasshouse Mountains region is how it pulls together in lobbying the state government for better public transport. Intriguingly, one of the things we're seeing now in the Melbourne railway system is that they're inserting new stations on pre-existing lines like the line north of Bendigo, the line to Ballarat. No one ever imagined that new stations would be developed. They just assumed you'd stick with the ones you had. All these lines used to have more railway stations than they do at the moment. Well, they're starting to reopen stations, which is really good. So thinking more about what you can do with the rail line to Gympie, I think, is very worthwhile. There's one thing that Queensland has to be proud of in this matter. The longest electrified passenger railway line in Australia is from Brisbane to Maryborough. It's a long railway line. There's nothing like that in Sydney or Melbourne.
All right, so I think that's about it. Thank you very much for coming on the show, and it's been really fun. I've loved having you on the show, and I appreciate you taking the time and your wife's participation in getting it all happening.
Very good.
Thank you very much.
Okay, good-o.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Streets and People podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with someone who'd find it helpful. Your small action could make a big difference. We're on all the usual podcasting platforms, so don't miss a single story. To find out what else we do, check out getaroundcaboolture.au. Until next time, remember, there's more than one way to get where you're going. Keep moving, keep listening, and keep imagining streets made for people.